Frank Turek posted a really interesting video where he talks with this young guy who's full of spit and vinegar. And the young guy asks him if God told you to kill your family, would, and then they talk about the Canaanite genocide. There's a lot to unpack in that video. And so we're going to do it in two or more parts. I'm going to start today by talking about, we're going to take a look at the initial minute or so of the clip and kind of debrief how Turek handles it and how I think one ought to handle it. Um, and some people, meaning like a few people, say to me, like, "Why do you keep talking about Frank Turek?" Well, first of all, I'm posting 300 videos a year. You're going to end up talking about different people and coming back to those same people. And Turek's one of the people I do come back to. And one reason is because he's an excellent foil, an excellent. He represents mainstream conservative evangelical apologetic opinion, things that I see time and again. And that makes him very good and effective to engage with and to highlight some of the weaknesses with that apologetic style, uh, as well on occasion, perhaps some of the strengths. But with that in mind, let's turn then to look at this clip at the first minute or so and then debrief it on the other side.
Dr. Turek, I'm only asking if you would murder your wife or children to prove your devotion. It's a simple question.
I don't know what would happen. And by the way, when God decides that someone should die, it's not murder for him.
Okay, first of all, it's interesting that for this 7 minute clip, what Turek chooses to highlight as the key idea, the key takeaway for this entire exchange is that when God tells you to kill somebody, it's not murder. It's the key takeaway. And I'm going to say that is not an effective response to the concern that religion and belief in God may lead people to do evil things, which in history it has. And a theistic and religious framework has been and can be used by people with mental illness, people, for example, who are schizophrenic, in order to provide a rationalizing framework for them and their delusions to carry out violence and perpetuate violence on others. Given some of those facts, this is not an encouraging beginning to this exchange. But now let's go back. Turek is going to show us what the young man actually says, the fuller exchange.
Dr. Turek, God commanded you to murder your wife or children to prove your faith in God. Is your current devotion not enough to prove your faith? Must you murder your children as Abraham was instructed?
First thing I'd want to say about the question itself, I mean, it's not honestly a very well-formed question. He's conflating different ideas. The one is, would you have to find some other way to prove your faith? The real question is, if God commands you to do something, are you morally obligated to do it? That's the real question. So this idea about proving your faith is just an unnecessary addition to the core issue, which is if God issues a command to you, are you obligated to follow through that command? Now, I'm going to come back to my answer on that in a moment, but first let's look at Turek's answer.
First of all, I don't know what I would do.
This is a simple yes or no question, Doc.
I don't know what I would do in Abraham's position.
Okay, I'm going to say, admit the candor, admit the honesty here. But again, that is not going to placate or satisfy people who are worried that you might go ahead and kill people because you believe God told you to do that. To say, well, I don't know if I would kill them or not. Honest, perhaps, but also, in my mind, not particularly helpful.
That's a good question. You know who really struggled with that? Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote a book called
Is your faith strong enough to murder your
Hold
own
on,
children
Cody,
or wife?
I'm thinking, and since I'm from New Jersey, it's really hard for me to do. So give me a minute.
That's good. That's effective. A little bit of self-deprecation. That's an effective style in apologetics always. So I commend Turek for having self-deprecation there. And I also sympathize with him because sometimes in the midst of it, right, you're trying to think of something and you just can't, right? I mean, colloquially, people call that a brain fart. Um, Anyway, so he's going to talk about here Søren Kierkegaard's book Fear and Trembling.
The book is called Fear and Trembling by Søren Kierkegaard. So I don't know what I would do, just like I'm never going to say if somebody put a gun to my head or a gun to my wife's head, what would you do? Because Peter tried that. I'll never deny you, Lord. And what did he do?
He denied him 3 times. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, it's interesting that Turek invokes the fact that Søren Kierkegaard wrote a book about this, but doesn't talk at all about what relevance Kierkegaard's analysis might have. It could be because um, Turek's not familiar with Kierkegaard's analysis, but the interesting thing is Kierkegaard's analysis here, where he argues for a teleological suspension of the ethical. In other words, this idea that um, it may be warranted to suspend what is the ethical thing to do in order to achieve some greater end. That is not, in my view, an encouraging or helpful analysis of the Abraham dilemma, as you might want to put it. So I'm not sure it's helpful to invoke Kierkegaard at this point. But then what we see Turek doing here is, look, I don't know what I would do, just as like I didn't know, just as like Peter thought he wouldn't deny Jesus and he did. So I guess what he's saying there, the comparison between Peter and Abraham is Abraham was faithful in being willing to kill his son, but Peter wasn't faithful in refusing to deny Jesus. It's an interesting comparison.
At the
So
crucifixion.
I don't know what I would do, okay? But let me point out, if your friend is an atheist, there's nothing wrong with God doing anything, because by atheism, there's no standard of right and wrong anyway. So in order for
Okay, that is just a cynical move. Turek here is first of all saying, I don't know if I would be faithful to kill my wife and children or not. Um, so in this equation, actually, I'm going to stop sharing now for a little bit. In this equation, he's not entirely sure that he would be faithful to kill his wife and children. But if he were, I presume that's the right answer in his mind. But then he wants to turn it around, and this is where you move into bad apologetics quite clearly, because what he's trying to do is shift the burden of proof by saying, yeah, but you as atheist, you don't even have any ground for any moral compass at all. So yeah, it's a rhetorical attempt to shift the burden of proof here. It says, well, you actually have to provide some basis for not being willing to kill your family or something like that. And this is just, first of all, it's just manifestly false. The claim that there are no defensible accounts of objective good and evil uh, on an atheistic account, a naturalistic account of ethics is just false. You could be, I mean, I point out multiple times, you could be a moral Platonist. You could believe that um, maybe not a naturalist, depending on how you define naturalism. You could be a moral Platonist that recognizes there are non-natural, non-physical, objective moral values of good and evil, and we recognize them, and you either choose to live with in accord with them or not. And if not, then you're committing evil. If you do, you're committing good. You're living in accord with the good. And you could have that account of reality without understanding that Platonic absolute to be theistic or divine in nature or personal, as in God. So, to put it bluntly, like a theistic moral objectivist is going to equate that objective moral absolute with a divine personal being. And the atheist who has an objective sense of good and evil, account of good and evil in their meta ethic, is not going to identify that with a personal divine being, i.e., God. But they both have moral objective account of reality. So on that count, Turek here is just deflecting, and it's really frustrating. But ultimately, what he's given us thus far in the video is the statement that yes, you should kill your wife and children, but I don't know if I would be faithful to do that. There's just so much wrong with this in my mind. The first thing I want to just say as to how I think you ought to respond to this is, let's say, well, in fact, what you are offering, and I mean, Turek obviously does think God has commanded people to commit atrocities like killing their children. So, fair enough. He couldn't give my response. But my response would begin with this. I don't think that God would command ever a parent to kill their child because that's a moral evil, and God would not command a moral evil. So, with that in mind, what I think that we have here is a per impossibile claim. And what that means is it's something that a person believes could not occur, but nonetheless is given as a hypothetical. And you can do that with any ethical system at all, including a theistic meta-ethical framework. So on this theistic meta-ethical framework, you can say, well, what if God commanded you to murder or to rape or something? Then would you do it? And that becomes a per impossibile counterfactual scenario. But you can do the same thing as, let's say, a moral utilitarian. You could say, a rule moral utilitarian. And so I believe there are certain rules you ought to never breach, but also you ought to always act to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And let's say you say one of those rules you ought never to breach is to murder somebody. So you have this qualified rule utilitarian account of the good. You always ought to act to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, but killing a person, murdering a person could never maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, ultimately. That's your framework. But then the objector gives a counter possible situation, and he says, "Yeah, but what if it were in fact the greatest good for the greatest number to kill a murder another human being? Then would you?" And that becomes much like what you're presenting to the theist. You can do that with any moral framework at all. Let's say that you are a Kantian and you believe that, again, you have a deontological norm that you ought never to murder. And again, you can just say, yeah, but what if the deontological norm on the Kantian framework turns out that sometimes you do murder people? Then would you? You know, it's this, you could do the same thing with any moral system. So often this question, which is presented as a kind of got you question for a Christian or a theistic ethicist who says, well, what if God commanded you to do X? If your background framework, as mine is that God would never command you to do X, well, then you just say this is a per impossibile claim, and you can do that for any moral system whatsoever. You can always say, yeah, but what if it were good to do this? Would you then do it? So that's my initial response. And what that does is it says essentially, look, everybody has that same problem that you can present that same counterfactual scenario to anyone or counter possible scenario. And as a result, that's not an objection as such to a theistic metaphysical or meta-ethical framework. Now, I've had these conversations with atheists, and often like the question will come, yeah, but what if you had a divine experience or spiritual experience and you believe God was commanding you to kill your child? What then? What would you do? Um, 15 years ago, I delivered a conference paper and I talked about the case of Dina Schlosser. She was a suburban housewife in Plano, Texas in 2004 who killed her infant because she believed God wanted her to give a sacrifice to show her devotion. Presumably, Dina Schlosser had some sort of spiritual experience preceding this, or that which she perceived to be a spiritual experience, which precipitated her actions. And I think the universal view is that was mentally ill. She was, I believe, schizophrenic, experiencing a religious delusion, and she committed a heinous atrocity as a result of that. If I were to have some kind of experience that led me to think God wanted me to commit an atrocity like killing my child, I would hope that I would recognize that I was experiencing a delusion. And I hope that I'd have people around me, insofar as they became aware of that, that would be able to step in as well and prevent that. And I could get the treatment that I would require in that situation. So people can have delusions and schizophrenic delusions and commit or believe they should commit atrocities, whether they're religious or not, spiritual or not. They could have any kind of rationalizing framework to that. So, I mean, that would be my quick response to that. Now, but what about Abraham? I don't think Soren Kierkegaard provides us a very helpful way to think about Abraham, at least not to ultimately wrestle with that most central question. But I do think a book that is more successful at this is titled Abraham's Silence, which was written a few years ago by biblical scholar Richard Middleton. So if you want to go into depth on how to understand and read the Akedah, the story of the offering of Isaac in Genesis 22, without sacrificing your moral intuitions, I would say look to biblical scholar Richard Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence, which I'm going to helpfully link below on Amazon. And if you want to support this channel, you can use my link in order to check out his book. On page 132, Middleton says this: I simply do not believe the God I have come to know would ever want me to sacrifice the life of another as proof of faithfulness, nor do I believe that this God values blind, unquestioning compliance. And throughout the book, first of all, I agree 100% with that intuition. But throughout the book, Abraham's Silence, Middleton gives a very careful reading and exegesis of the text to argue and support the claim that when properly read, Genesis 22 is condemning Abraham for not having pushed back at the divine command that he had ostensibly received. That Abraham was expected to challenge it. The test was not would he be willing to kill his son, but would he be willing to follow the right and the good by challenging this very claim? Because that very challenge defines who Israel is. Jacob became Israel because he wrestled with the angel through the night. And God's people have always been defined as Israel because the intimacy of their relationship with God is evidenced precisely in their willingness to challenge what are ostensibly commands given by God or actions on the part of God. The intimacy of their relationship is testified in their very willingness and ability to challenge and question. And that is at the heart of what is happening in Genesis 22, according to Richard Middleton's reading. I'm not going to summarize the book here for you, but I think it is a fascinating read which honors the text and a rigorous critical and exegetical and hermeneutical engagement with the text without sacrificing your moral intuitions or leaving you just with a milquetoast response of saying, I don't know what I would do if God commanded me to kill my children or wife. Instead, what you say is God would never command such a thing. And the intimacy of our relationship with God is found precisely in the fact that we're willing to challenge all putative claims to commit such evil moral atrocities. Giving a response like that, I think, would be infinitely more credible as an apologetic witness and would also be ethically infinitely more defensible than the milquetoast response, waffling response that Frank Turek gives in this excerpt.